Bonjour à tous, bienvenue à la Bibliothèque nationale de France. I will switch to English now. Dear colleagues and dear partners, it's really a great pleasure for me to introduce this large seminar and to welcome you today at the Bibliothèque nationale de France for this conference on strengthening public trust in science. On behalf of the French National Research Agency and its partner Science Europe, I would like to really thank you for joining us for what we believe is an essential discussion. And it also coincides with the INR's 20th anniversary. Trust in science is a cornerstone of democratic decision-making and evidence-based public policy. It's also vital for our ability to address the major challenges of our time, from global health crisis to climate change, from the emergence of new technologies of growing social uncertainties. Here we all know that this trust is increasingly fragile. Misinformation spreads faster than ever, scientific controversies become highly visible, and new technologies such as artificial intelligence fuel both hope and apprehension. Our goal today is to better understand these dynamics and above all, to explore how we can collectively strengthen public trust in science. This is why we have gathered experts from across Europe and beyond, researchers, policymakers, communication specialists, media representatives, and institutional leaders. This conference has three main objectives. First, to identify the key factors that undermine public confidence in science, scientists, and research institutions. Understanding these factors is really essential if we want to respond effectively. Second, to examine the relationships between science, society, and the media, how knowledge circulates, how debates are shaped, and how values and perceptions influence public engagement. And third, to share best practices in science communication, transparency, and public engagement with the aim of developing concrete recommendations for research funding organizations, research institutions, and the media. We have designed an agenda that combines analysis, debate, and forward-looking perspectives. We will begin with a keynote speak from Kei Kozumi, a former deputy director of OSTP in the White House in the USA, who will offer insights from international science policy and the recent global experience. Session 1 will look at trends in public trust across Europe and what they tell us about science literacy and the understanding of the scientific method. Session 2 will explore how trust is affected by controversy, uncertainty, and rapid technological change, and how ethics and integrity can support credibility. After lunch, Session 3 will examine how dialogue, values, and participatory approaches can foster trust between science and society. And finally, Section 4 will focus on the role and responsibilities of research organizations and policymakers in building a trustworthy research environment, one that is transparent, protective of researchers, and open to society. Here we are in a library, in the amphitheater of a large library. Libraries are places where we read, where we learn, but also where we work in small groups. Well, with you in this amphitheater and the people online in the Zoom connection, we're not really in a small group. We are in a very large group. But still, we want really to work together and to produce something today. Our ambition is not only to diagnose challenges, but also to build a roadmap for action. The conclusion we draw together will feed into a final statement highlighting key recommendations and best practices. They will also guide future collaborations between scientists, educators, policymakers, and the media. And building trust in science is not the responsibility of one institution alone or one category of actor alone. It requires researchers who communicate clearly, media that report responsibly, institutions that act transparently, and policymakers who value scientific evidence. Above all, it requires dialogue and an honest, open, and continuous one. I would like to warmly thank our speakers, moderators, partners, and participants here and online. Your expertise will really help us to draw lessons and craft solutions that can be implemented across the research and media ecosystems. So I wish you all a very rich and inspiring day of discussion, and thank you for your attention. I want now to call Francisco Javier Moreno Fuentes, Vice President of International Affairs in the Spanish National Research Council, the CSIC. But today, Francisco Javier represents Science Europe as the Vice President of Science Europe. Please.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It is great to know you are all there, although we cannot see you from here, but I am sure there is many of you because I saw you when I came into the room. Of course, first of all, thank you to the organizers, to the ANR, who is just celebrating its 20th anniversary, and who, together with Science Europe, is organizing this conference on trust in science. And of course, anytime we organize an event, we think this event is fundamental and we must all be focused on it. The truth is that this topic we are addressing today is really important. It is one of these occasions in which both urgent things and important things can be done at the same time. Often we ignore important to address urgent more quickly. Well, today we are addressing both of these things at the same time because the issue of trust, and in particular trust in science, it's absolutely fundamental for all organizations. I understand we all come from the world of knowledge and science in one way or another, and as it will be evident in the development of this conference, we are facing very challenging times with regards to this particular aspect. I'm a political scientist myself, so allow me to say a few things about the concept of trust from this particular point of view. Trust is one of these things that we don't pay much attention to until it disappears. And then we realize how important it was. Trust is some kind of glue to our societies. There is a very long tradition of sociological and political science work on trust, and it is extremely clear that trust is what allows our societies to function on a daily matter, on a daily way. It very clearly decreases transaction cost in our economy, but basically in our everyday life. When we interact with others, if we can trust them to start with, we don't need to, introduce all kinds of barriers in the interaction coming from fear or the perception that the other person is a threat or is looking to take something away from us, right? So in the fact that we can simply walk on the streets is the consequence of the fact that we have trust on each other, and most importantly, probably trust on the state, that the state is going to keep society organized and a certain level of order, which will allow us to go along with our daily concerns. This very specific notion of trust is also fundamental because it allows our societies to remain basically cohesive, basically. We all, different groups and different individuals, very much functioning on a daily basis because of the perception that we all belong into this community that we can basically trust. And also it goes for collaboration. When in everything we do is the consequence of many people and many institutions interacting on a constant basis. And the consequence of that is our extremely complex and sophisticated societies more or less functioning. If trust was not there, none of this would be possible. So it is extremely important that trust functions and is not eroded. When it comes to science in particular, Why is it that science should matter to us? Why is it that we should be concerned about the possible erosion of trust in science? Well, the truth is that science has operated for the last couple of centuries as some sort of legitimacy paradigm for our societies. In the process of secularization, when we left religion basically on the private domain, and we basically decided to move towards the path of rationality and laws to rule our societies, we did that on the assumption that knowledge would allow us to function in this way. Knowledge was basically the foundation for this rational system that we were basically establishing. Our very institutions were established on the fundamental of rationality, and this rationality was precisely coming from the belief that knowledge would allow us to constantly progress and to constantly have answers to the challenges that we will face as societies and as mankind, right? This role of science as the beacon, as the kind of the light guiding mankind has, with some up and downs, obviously, operated quite well for the last couple of centuries. But I would say that in the last 20 or 30 years, there is a weakening of this perception of science and knowledge as the guiding principles of our societies. There are probably many reasons for that. Some of them have to do with the very consequences of the implementation of knowledge and the unexpected consequences of this, particularly we could say mistakes and wrongdoings and accidents derived from technological development. We could just think of nuclear accidents, pollution of our oceans, of our air, of our land, as a consequence of some sort of arrogance that we all share as mankind, that through our knowledge we could simply dominate nature and the planet, and there would be no side effects of that. The problem is that there has been plenty of side effects. So in that respect, science is also a part of the original problem that in a way puts us in the position where we are right now. But at the same time, science remains the only alternative, the only option to address those very challenges, right? So understanding with some humbleness the limitations of our capacities as scientists, we must also continue working, because it is going to be through knowledge and through technological development that we will be able to respond to the global challenges that we are facing. So in that sense, in addition to pursuing knowledge for the sake of knowledge, which is something that we all do, or many of us do in our scientific endeavors, we must also have very, very clear in mind the idea that science must be useful to society at large. Not only, of course, to the economy or to civil society and citizens or to policymakers, but to the whole of it, right? I mean, science remains, with all the questioning that we may have, the only hope we have to address our challenges as a collective species. What is new about all of this in the more recent years is the fact that there are articulated interests that actually count on weakening the trust in science for pursuing their own specific goals. And these goals, I will not elaborate much. I'm sure they will be developed during the rest of the day. But on the one hand, these goals have political objectives. If the trust in science is questioned, it is easier to sell to citizens specific packages of ideas which are not grounded on any kind of empirical work or scientific analysis of the facts. So scientific facts can be sometimes annoying for the achieving of certain political goals. That is one of the threats. The other threat I would point out is this perception that somehow technology can be emancipated from science. In a way, we can see today certain technological powers which of course derive from scientific knowledge in origin, but which are in practice used to question the very legitimacy of scientific knowledge and are used for a specific either economic or political gains. So in this sense, science is very much threatened today by some of its children, we could say, and we must be more humble than ever, but also more hardworking than ever to continue trying to provide the knowledge that our societies need. So in Science Europe and in the Spanish National Research Council, both of the institutions that I'm working on and representing today here, we are trying to do precisely this. We are trying to adjust the way in which scientific institutions operate to be more aware of these challenges, to be aware of the fact that they need to fine-tune the way they work. It's not only anymore about publishing in the top journals. We also must be very careful about showing our citizens the usefulness, the actual positive effects of the knowledge they fund with their taxes and we develop in our laboratories. And this must be done in a constant work towards our own scientific communities, towards society at large, and towards policymakers in particular. So I just hope I transmitted to you the importance of discussing about this aspect of trust in science. I didn't want to worry you, but actually a little bit, yes. I want you to be concerned about this dimension. It's not something we should consider just one additional marginal thing within the general discussion about the importance of science. This is a very central aspect, because if there is no trust in science, well, there will be no funding for science, first of all, but there may be no science at all. So thank you very much for your being here and for your patience, and I very much look forward to the discussions that we'll be having today. Thank you.
Merci. Let me now introduce Ezra Clark. Ezra is the Chief of the Science, Technology and Innovation Policy section of the UNESCO. Please, Ezra.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. It's really my pleasure to join you this morning to represent UNESCO and to contribute to the opening of this conference on strengthening public trust in science. So I'd first like to start by thanking the French government, ANR, and Science Europe for convening this meeting and for placing this issue of trust in science at the centre of the 20th anniversary celebrations. Trust, after all, is not a peripheral issue in science, but it's one of the enabling conditions. Across the world, societies rely on science to guide action on climate change, on health, on biodiversity, and rapid technical transformation. And yet, as our programme today emphasises, the conditions that sustain trust are frequently under strain. Disinformation can flourish, boundaries between evidence and opinion can blur, and emerging technologies, such obviously as AI, generate profound uncertainty about what is credible and who to believe. Complexity can be easily lost or distorted in the media environment. For example, and I guess an obvious example, is the COVID pandemic, in which some countries saw how rapidly confidence could erode amidst uncertainty and misinformation. A crisis in trust in science due to misinformation and disinformation, but also a lack of transparency and inclusion. Indeed, in our discussions on this issue, we've even asked whether trust is even the right word, or our understanding of what we really mean by trust, arguing that what we truly seek is not a kind of blind confidence, but an informed understanding and healthy questioning and an engagement with science. So in strengthening public trust, we need to be clear that for example, scientific uncertainty is not a flaw to be hidden, but it's precisely what makes science trustworthy, because it shows that evidence is questioned, tested, and constantly refined, something perhaps not always well communicated. And in fact, this concern echoes those raised by the United Nations Secretary General's Scientific Advisory Board, which warned of growing mistrust fueled by perceptions of scientific elites, the misspread of information, disinformation, and the need to strengthen community-level networks of trusted scientific voices. For UNESCO, trust in science is inseparable from the right of everyone to participate in and share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And this is a principle anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and reaffirmed in UNESCO's 2021 recommendation on open science. And this message was strongly reinforced by the declaration which came out of the 11th World Science Forum last year, which warns of the dangers posed by the intentional undermining of trust in science, and called upon global communities to uphold scientific integrity, openness, and equity as foundations for trustworthy scientific enterprise. Trust erodes when people feel excluded from scientific knowledge, when access to data and results are closed, and when research systems reflect inequalities rather than address them. The global and inclusive vision at the heart of the International Decade for Sciences for Sustainable Development, which ran from 2024 up to 2033, which was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly, and which UNESCO leads the implementation. The decade highlights that we must build science systems that are more responsive to societal needs, more open, more equitable, and fundamentally more human-centred. It also emphasises that trust cannot be strengthened only through better communication. Trust grows when science demonstrably improves people's lives. And from a developing country perspective, the trust challenges takes on additional dimensions. Many countries face structural barriers, limited investment in research, unequal access to digital infrastructures, and insufficient representation in global scientific agendas. 80% of countries invest less than 1% of their GDP in research and development. And only about a third of the world's researchers are women. So these disparities, for example, shape not only scientific capacity, but also perceptions of whose knowledge counts, whose expertise is heard, and who benefits from innovation. Therefore, strengthening trust must also mean strengthening fairness, strengthening equality. It requires that scientific partnerships need to be genuinely collaborative, scientific data and tools to be openly accessible, and questions driving research reflect the priorities of communities in every region, not only the priorities of well-resourced countries or systems. And this broader commitment to fairness and inclusion is also reflected in the G20 recommendation on science engagement, which came out of the G20 Research and Innovation Working Group earlier this year, which underscores really how building trust requires open science, multilingual access to knowledge, and broad participation in scientific engagement across diverse communities. And at UNESCO, we see, I think, some encouraging momentum. The increasing interest in scientific literacy, a movement towards open science, and this was clearly demonstrated to us in the monitoring process, which we just carried out with all our member states who reported back to us this year on their monitoring of the 2021 recommendation on open science. And the push for expansion of participatory and citizen science initiatives, which we're also seeing. So this momentum is further reinforced by the recent proposal to establish the 27th of November every year as International Day of Engagement in Science for Sustainable Development, which is intended to raise awareness of the value of public participation in science and to strengthen the image of scientists and researchers worldwide. UNESCO's programs on science popularization, including the Kalinga Prize for the Popularization of Science, which will be celebrating its 75th anniversary next year, contribute directly to strengthening public trust by expanding spaces where people can engage in, question and understand science. But it doesn't come from dissemination alone, this trust. It emerges from dialogue. It also requires that researchers feel safe to engage publicly without fear of harassment or misrepresentation. And this obligation is clearly articulated in the 2017 UNESCO recommendation on science and scientific researchers, which calls on governments and institutions to ensure enabling environments for open and responsible scientific communication. Ultimately, what we seek is not simply trust in science, but trustworthy science, transparent, inclusive, reflective, and accountable. A science that is open about uncertainty, that's honest about its limitations, and that is attentive to social context in which knowledge is produced and used. And today, this challenge is sharpened by the growing shift of cutting-edge research, and particularly here we can think of AI or quantum, and this move into private sector environments where the transparency, openness and public accountability is not always guaranteed. And we can think of trust as a communications challenge to be solved rather a relationship to be built and nurtured between science and society, between researchers and policymakers, and across regions with vastly different capacities and with histories. So UNESCO stands ready to continue to work with all partners across the regions, all regions, to advance this shared commitment to trustworthy, inclusive and people-centred science. With that, I'll say thank you very much, and I wish you all very fruitful reflections and discussions throughout the day and this rather exciting looking programme. Thank you very much.